Thank you very much. So I'm very pleased to be here today. As Christine has mentioned, I am the country officer for DRC within Proparco, which is a development agency, and I'm also an experienced investor in Africa across multiple products, including venture capital and angel investments. And I'm very pleased today to try to understand how the pandemic has changed the way we need and we should define inclusive investment. We know today that the pandemic has had a material impact on the way our economies are put together, lockdown restrictions, social distancing, and a whole type of new regulation has had an impact on how businesses are performing, are run, how workers are adding value to the companies they work in. And the pandemic also had an impact on how investors can actually allocate capital to invested companies. Just one simple example, the fact that we are not able to travel anymore means that it's very difficult for investors to check the investment in country, in cities, and it warrants a new mindset when it comes to thinking about investing in a world that has been impacted by the pandemic. I think the last lesson that we got for this pandemic is that the economies as they were built have within themselves a high level of discrepancies and social and economic inequalities, and this has been really highlighted by the pandemic when it comes to employment, education and healthcare. And we've seen how some people have been negatively impacted by the pandemic when it comes to having a job or not, having revenues which are linked to unemployment or not. We've seen how education has been managed differently, whether you had the opportunity to have access to online education or not. And obviously when it comes to healthcare, depending on which countries you were in, or even within the countries, which cities you were in, you would have access to a vaccine against COVID or not. So at this stage, it's very important that as a society, we all think again about how redefining inclusive investment so that we can build a more resilient and sustainable society that can benefit everyone. So if we go to the next slide, we are just trying to define very briefly what is an inclusive investment. To do that, we just want to use a typical traditional definition in terms of how some companies and how human beings have been excluded from the investment space, whether it is from an investor perspective or a company perspective. And typically discriminations would include, gender. So for instance, it's quite interesting to see that the pandemic has led to an increase in female-led businesses and female-led investor group. So we can see how the gender bias is being tackled also on the back of the pandemic. And obviously there are other types of discrimination that we all know based on the ethnicity, the age, family background, and a bunch of other metrics. So the question here now is how can we redefine inclusive investment, which means that it would be an investment that would not discriminate any entities or human beings based on some of the factors that I have mentioned, and how can we provide adequate, sustainable, and fair investment solutions that will generate significant social returns without adversely impacting the society and the environment. We are all well aware that the pandemic has highlighted the need to build businesses, commercial entities, and to incorporate human beings in a way that is sustainable and that is resilient when it comes to shocks like a pandemic. So I think in this context, as a guideline, we can definitely use the United Nations Sustainable Goals that have been, defined by the United Nations. I've put on the right-hand side of the slide a summary of those goals, which include, for instance, reduction of poverty, access to water, and a bunch of other, goals that are definitely key to build, sustainable societies, and keeping in mind that we want to be inclusive. If we go to the next slide, I will just focus on We can go to the next slide, and I will just focus on 3 things when it comes to redefining inclusive investment. First, I will focus on the target investee companies. I will focus then on the investors, and I will focus on the strategies that we need to use to redefine inclusive investment. But first, let's start with targeted investees companies. So first, what are the entities that need to be targeted by investment? Traditionally, only commercial, profitable companies would benefit from institutional investments. But I think the pandemic has highlighted the fact that it's quite important to focus on a new concept of social enterprise, companies that are both generating returns and creating strong social impact, and all of that while the company is also operating within an environment that are governed by rules, whether in those rules are set up by governments, but it's also important to make sure that we are protecting the environment, that we are making sure that the health of human beings is being protected. So the concept of social enterprise that is mindful of the environment in which it operates is really key when it comes to redefining inclusive investment. I've just put on the right-hand side a couple of documentation or concepts that are key when it comes to this new concept of social enterprise that we need to redefine. And we can see some companies putting together company charters whereby they explain their corporate social responsibility policies that are put in place and or the ESG policies that are key to make sure that their companies are both generating returns, adding value, producing products and or offering services that are obviously useful for the consumers, but are also mindful of their environment. Second, I think it's really important to make sure that we are inclusive in terms of geography, and not only when it comes to the countries, and historically we had the difference between developed and emerging markets, but also within countries we see that there has been less development between rural areas compared to urban areas. So I think it's really very important that inclusive investments on the back of the pandemic focus on cross-border community-led investment that are really inclusive of all the geographical areas in a given geography. And finally, I think the pandemic has highlighted how important it is to focus on sectors that are not only productive, but that are also leading to an improvement of the environment in which the human beings are operating. So it's important to focus on investments that are focusing on tech-led sectors and on sectors that are not necessarily perceived as adding value, like education and healthcare, like in terms of sectors that have not received a huge amount of allocation in certain countries. And I think today everybody is aware that those sectors are also key to add value to the society as a whole. So we need to go beyond the traditional scope of investment when it comes to target investee companies, and the concept of social enterprise, which is mindful of the environment and that is inclusive both in terms of geography and sectors, is really key. So the next slide. Next slide. Thank you. Before that one. Thank you. So what are the strategies that investors need to put in place? Obviously, impact investment is really fashionable, and especially on the back of the pandemic. It's important to focus on investment strategies that are profitable, generating returns, but the concept of social returns is also important, meaning that the strategy must have a positive impact, not only in terms of the businesses or for the shareholders and the investors, but the investment must also have a positive impact on employees, on clients, on suppliers, so basically on all the stakeholders that are evolving around the company that is benefiting from the investment. And then it's important that the investments are sustainable, so strategies must be sustainable, so inclusive in terms of companies targeted, and making sure that the returns benefits not only the companies, but also the entire ecosystem. And sustainable in terms of climate, obviously. I think climate change is really like a concept that people are well aware of right now. And again, it's key for all of us to follow guidelines such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, I think it's really important for impact investment strategies to be value additive. We have the concept of tech for good, or to take care of the well-being of communities. So it's quite important that investment strategies keep that in mind. So always generating attractive returns and mitigating risk while generating a measurable social and environmental impact. And finally, if we go to the last slide, I think it's quite interesting to see that the pandemic has enabled us to redefine the concept of investor. And obviously, we still rely on public entities such as government, international agencies, and so on to invest massively on infrastructure, which can include, like roads, electricity, connectivity, and a bunch of other things. And also for public entities to put in place a regulatory framework that will enable social enterprises and communities to thrive. But I think we are seeing more and more institutional investors moving away from the concept of investment for profit, but moving more towards responsible investment, which is inclusive by definition. And finally, I think it's great to see that the concept of crowdfunding is really, growing all over the world. And we can see that more and more social projects are crowdfunded by regular people who are definitely putting capital in spaces where they think that they can generate sustainable returns. So in all, it's exciting to be living in a place where we have the ability to redefine the concept of inclusive investment. And the pandemic has allowed us to do that. And I'm really looking forward to continue to network and interact with you guys to build a sustainable planet on the back of impact and meaningful investments.